How's it going, my fellow heretics? Welcome to the Heretical Heathen Podcast. I am your host, Robert Knox. And this week, we're going to continue our Scrying series. If you haven't been following along, I have been making an attempt as per my program that I'm currently working through. And that program is Isaac Hill's The Heathen Golden Dawn. If you guys are interested in ceremonial magic, but you're also heathens and aren't sure where to start, I would definitely suggest looking at Isaac's work. Additionally, you might be able to find some articles written by John Michael Greer online. These are great resources for anyone interested in the ceremonial process, but haven't really dove into the Western magical tradition, or maybe even somebody who's put off by characters like Crowley. If that's something that you're interested in, please go check it out and tell them Robert Knox sent you. I mean, they don't have no idea who I am, but still, drop my name. Put me out there. With that said, let's get back to the runes. Thus far, I have scryed Fehu, Urazas, and Thurasas, and this episode will be dedicated to Ansuz. Ansuz got a little tricky, a little whimsical. Something about Ansuz was really different than the first three. Much like Thurasas, my first attempts at scrying were an absolute failure. I had a very hard time focusing, and my wife was watching TV, and I could hear that. And that's not her fault, that's on me. I probably should have picked a better time to do these things. But I decided to go for it anyway, so I did some of my opening procedures. Not them all, which that'll come in a bit later. And so I stepped into my temple. And the first thing that I found after I left and walked through the image of the rune was sort of a Norse temple that was giant and golden. But as I approached it, the golden colors faded away and it became more natural. Upon going inside, I noticed a long trough filled with fire, sort of like the standard image of like a Nordic longhouse, if you guys have ever seen that. And on the sides of the longhouse were benches. Makes a lot of sense. Heat, long trough, fire down the middle, benches on each side. And so I decided to sit on one of the benches and start watching the fire. And as I was sitting there, a woman appeared. A very good-looking woman, brunette, couldn't quite make out her clothes. And she started asking me what it was that I was doing. I placed my arm around her, and then I explained to her my current situation and my inability to focus. But then, just to be sure, as I've been in these spaces a few times, I made a sacred symbol, and she failed the test. And so I knew that this was not a person, this was not a being, I suppose person works too, of which that I should be in communication with. So I got up and I started to leave. And then suddenly, she stood up and lunged at me with both hands, grabbing my throat. And out of nowhere, I raised my right hand right up to her chest, and through my hand came bright light, and the light repelled her. Now, this is kind of interesting for me in particular, because this isn't something I read in a book or I heard from any podcaster, and I've never heard it from any frauder or any mason that I know of. It was just something that I did instinctually. There's something about the light that just repels some of these beings sometimes. After this encounter, I turned to what appeared to be a throne at the end of the hall. And so I walked up to the throne, and sat on the throne was a Jarl-like figure. Picture Skyrim if you're a nerd. And of course, like most beings in this space, I couldn't make him out. The way I described it is there's like a dimmer switch, and sometimes the light's really bright, and you can make out a lot of detail, and then other times the switch is turned down, and things are harder to make out. And so I walked up to this Jarl-like figure, much like the woman from before. I acknowledged to this kingly figure that I couldn't quite focus, And so he opened the door back to my temple, which I should have taken as a odd sign. I don't know why I thought this was a good idea, or I thought that these other beings could potentially do that. Regardless, he opened the door and I walked through it, and I found what you might call, I guess, a spirit animal, a Fealgia, something of that nature. One that's typically in my temple, only this time it lunged at me, grew very large, and tried to kill me. And not so suddenly, I realized this was not actually my sacred space. And so, what I did was I invoked the Most High, the Platonic One, potentially the Gununga Gap if we're doing like a Platonic read of the Eddas. And when I did that, this being backed off, and another door opened, leading to my actual temple. Now, if you've watched or listened to some of my other episodes, you'll know when I end a session, I try to go back into my temple, sit in the chair that I'm sitting in my room, and then come back into my body. And so I did just that. Except this time, it didn't work. I didn't go back into my body. And suddenly, the sort of wanderer Gandalf-like figure that I see in a lot of these sessions burst through the door. Now, I've never had any being come through the door. I didn't know that was possible. And if you ever wonder if these things are just psychological, you have moments like this where things kind of seem like they're going slightly off the rails and you're not in control at all. And you realize that in moments like that it doesn't seem like I'm in control. And so I'm sitting there, this wizard-like figure walks through the door, and he told me that he had something he wanted to show me. So I got up, and I followed him, and he brought me into what can be described as pure darkness, an absolute void. He then explained to me that this sort of pure darkness, or rather pure light maybe, is the nature of all things. That the whole idea that there are separate and distinct things is an illusion. Everything is one thing in some sense. Now, if you've read any of my work or listened to a few of my episodes, you will know that I tend to be a Platonic thinker, and so this falls in line with my metaphysics at large. And after this moment, I went back into my temple, sat down, and I went back to my body. Except it was difficult. I couldn't move. And it was kind of like all of me wasn't back. Like there was still pieces of me lost in the imaginal. If you've ever woken up and been kind of groggy and feel like you're not quite there, it's a very similar feeling. It's been a few weeks and I still don't quite know what to make of that. But immediately after, I decided to consult the runes to decide if I was going to make another attempt at scrying Ansuz or if I should just stop now. And I pulled a Perthro, an Iwaz, and an Algies. I took this as a positive sign that I should make another attempt. However, I should do more to protect myself. And if you recall earlier, I mentioned that I didn't quite do all the things that I normally do when I go into these spaces. I skipped a step just to experiment to see if there's any real difference from, let's say, wearing an iron pendant or doing a certain ritual beforehand. And so I decided I would go back to my original method and we'll have another go at scrying Ansuz. During my second attempt, I did all the normal rituals I normally do, the banishing rituals, the invoking rituals. I threw on an iron Mjolnir. There's some attestations, I think in multiple cultures, that suggest that iron might keep away harmful spirits. And after the weirdness of the first attempt, I thought it would be wise to wear the Mjolnir. At the very least, give it a shot, test it out, see if it actually does anything or not. Now, unlike some of my other sessions, this session was very, very brief. I did my rituals, sat in my chair, I got into that meditative space, put myself in my temple, and when I left, I was immediately in the celestial realms. and I was greeted by 3 different figures. You can probably guess what they look like. They were all different color robes, and they told me that their image was a container. It's not real. It's like an illusion. It's a way for my consciousness to interact with, let's say, the gods, the spirits, the daimons, the Filgias, whatever these things happen to be. So the images are a container. Now, this was really interesting because I was then told that Ansuz, the rune, had been guiding me for the entire night prior to doing this, leading me to teachers that would plant this seed so I could finally see it. These figures then showed me an image of light and an image of dark, and they told me that this was a lesson that I had to learn. Is that regardless of appearances, even if something seems holy, angelic, whatever word you want to use, it doesn't mean you should freely give your trust away. You should be skeptical of all of these things. And thankfully, that's a lesson that I got. It was something that I sort of intuitively got, or maybe I have trust issues, who knows? That's probably the case. However, if you're listening to this and you're going to make an attempt at scrying or shamanic journeying or whatever modality leads you down this path, that's a lesson for you too. Don't trust the images. If you see something that looks like an angel or that looks like a god or that's just a ball of luminous light, do not trust it. Not inherently. Make sure you have your things in line to test these things to make sure they're not there to harm you. And then I was told something that was very curious. And I mentioned this on my recent interview with Midgard Musings. If you guys haven't watched that, go check out Jesse's podcast, Midgard Musings. It's fantastic. It's on Spotify. I was told that the runes are gods. They're deities. Now, if you're a heathen and you're hearing that, that's probably a hard sell. You could probably hear the brakes grinding to a halt. I've never heard of anything like this. I'm sure most of you haven't either. When we think of runes, what a lot of people think of is the Futhark, or the Anglo-Saxon Futhork. They were a writing system. And there are a few attestations like Tacitus, well, I think primarily Tacitus, who suggests that the Germanic people held in high regard the casting of lots, and that people would take strips, they would put markings on them, and they would cast them onto a cloth and then read them. Now, us moderns don't know what that means. They didn't say runes, but it had to be a symbol common enough that most people would find them familiar, or at least have some kind of understanding of them. And so we often think that there's a good likelihood that what they were working with were, in fact, runes. And so that's what comes to mind first. And then we think of all of the esoteric work and casting and divination and the rune yoga. But nobody's ever thought, what if these things are something more? And admittedly, I haven't either until now. Now, when I say the runes are gods or the runes are deities, again, use whatever word makes you personally feel comfortable. I don't mean that the little etching, the little stave, or the marks on the stave, I don't mean those are gods. That would be absurd. It'd be fucking ridiculous. What I mean is those markings can act as a container in the same way that the wizard image that I see acts as a container for something higher. Now, in the Platonic corpus, the whole world is filled with gods, and there are higher and lower gods. Hierarchy language gets a little tricky. It's really hard to imagine, but that's primarily a failure of language. And so we might have what they would call psychic gods, and we don't mean like the cringy crystal hippie pretending to read cards or your dead loved ones coming to them or something fucking stupid like that. We mean like gods of the soul, right? These are like lower gods, sort of in between you and the higher realms. You might say nous in the Platonic tradition. And you can think of these psychic gods as the sort of gods you see in myths around the world. These would be gods like Odin, Thor, Hercules. And then there are higher gods. So you might say that there are particular gods, let's say of gods of, using that loosely, of justice. You might have a god like Odin and a god like Mercury. And these are both gods who are like oriented towards wisdom. A Platonist would say these are gods participating in wisdom. But you might think that, or perhaps it's better to say one way of thinking about it is that both gods are participating in this higher thing called wisdom, and wisdom itself is also a god. It's a higher manifestation, a higher emanation, a higher god. And I think what this vision was trying to point me towards is that the lower gods that we're used to talking about, again, hierarchy language, I don't mean to dismiss things like Odin and Thor as less than, but these gods are participating in higher patterns, in higher deities. And there's a sense in which, let's say I bloat to Odin, I give him a gift, he gives me a gift back. There's a gifting exchange there, and that sort of gifting is a pattern we're both participating in, but that pattern is itself a deity, and it's higher than both of us. So things like wisdom, beauty, justice, number, these things are all potentially gods. They're deities, they're divine forces, if that language makes you feel more comfortable. Now, for a Platonist, we might say that these things are sort of coexistence with the forms. If you're a heathen and you're maybe uncomfortable with that language, you could say that these are like celestial gods, whereas the gods we're used to dealing with on a day-to-day basis are like messengers in between those gods and us. And it's sort of the job of these messenger gods to raise us up into the celestial realms, to help our soul ascend and go back up towards the one, towards divinity. Or perhaps a better way of saying it, it's to help us realize the divine nature in everything. Now, I'm not saying that the runes are more important than Thor or Bragi or Freyr. I'm just saying that they're also divine. And if we're using Platonic language, maybe you could say that they're higher in the hierarchy. But again, this is a complication of language, and there's no good way to talk about these things. But I kind of think this view makes a lot of sense just pragmatically, too. Because we have this thing that we sometimes call the problem of many pantheons. And so what a lot of people will try to do is they will look at gods from across pantheons and say, well, maybe those are the same gods. Maybe Thor is Heracles. Maybe Odin is Zeus. Or maybe all of these gods are their own particular gods. But all of these particular gods are participating in more universal forms of godliness, more universal forms of the divine, of soul. And we can use the names of the runes like a Buddhist uses seed words or a Hindu uses mantras, and we can use those to orient our soul, to bring them into union with these higher forces. Or maybe you could say draw those higher forces down into us. I'm not sure if the language precisely matters. And so that's an argument for rune esotericism if you didn't already participate in anything like that. Now might be the time. These things are way more important than we've thought they were. And I'm glad to be the one who this was spoken to. A lot of people get weird about sharing these experiences. They feel like they're deeply personal. And they're right. They are. But what good is the point in doing the great work if you're not bringing back what you've learned to the tribe? Maybe that's all this is going to be. I'm going to bring back some weird wisdom from wacky visions. And maybe it's going to spark some of you to do something. Maybe it'll inspire you to take up a practice. Maybe you'll hear the call of the gods and whatever silly bullshit I happen to be saying on any given week. With that said, I think that's the end of this week's episode. Thank you all for tuning in. I am your host, Robert Knox, and this is the Heretical Heathen Podcast. Thank you all for listening, and have a wonderful night, folks.